budgeted for that, planned the staffing around it, and warned the department directors that during the conversion window, we would be operating with reduced retrieval capacity on anything older than of the audit, and I have no interest in dramatizing what follows. I am a senior building code compliance investigator. My work is unglamorous by design. I verify that permits were issued under proper authority, that inspections occurred in the correct sequence, that occupancy was not granted before life safety sign-off, and that the paper agrees with the building. When the city contracted with a vendor to replace our 40-year-old permitting database with an integrated platform, somebody had to certify that the historical records being imported were clean. That was me. The assignment was narrow. I was not asked to investigate anyone. I was asked to determine whether decades of permits had been processed under an administrative error before we locked the old data into a new system where errors would be far harder to correct. The way the migration worked, the vendor's software ingested our legacy permit records and flagged anomalies for human review. Most flags were trivial: a misaligned date field, a permit number entered with a transposed digit, an inspector's initials where a full signature was required. I cleared hundreds of these a day. The system also ran a deduplication and authority validation pass, which cross-referenced every permit's approving official against the personnel directory to confirm that the approver had been a real, authorized employee at the time of approval. This is standard. You cannot have valid permits signed by people who lack the authority to sign them. Cedar Street first appeared in my queue as a clustering anomaly. The validation engine had flagged 41 permits in a single batch because they all shared the same approving official identifier, and the directory lookup for that identifier had returned no match. 41 unmatched approvals from one reviewer is unusual but not alarming. Older employee records were the weakest part of our archive, and missing directory entries from the 1970s and 1980s were common. I assumed the approver was simply a planning officer whose personnel record had not survived. I made a note to backfill the directory entry from payroll and moved on. I could not backfill it. Payroll had nothing. The approving official's identifier was a clean, well-formed employee number in our standard format. The format itself dated the issuance to the mid-1950s, when the city first adopted numeric employee identifiers. The number appeared on permit after permit, decade after decade, always rendered the same way, always paired with the same signature, a compact and unremarkable cursive that I would come to recognize without effort. But the number had no corresponding entry in payroll, no entry in the civil service appointment ledger, no personnel file in the archive, no W-2 history, no pension record, no retirement disbursement, no termination notice, and no death certificate cross-reference through the county. The number authorized things. It belonged to no one. This is the point at which I want to be careful, because the temptation in a situation like this is to leap. I did not leap. I have seen too many compliance officers manufacture conspiracies out of records-keeping decay. The likeliest explanation, by far, was that I was looking at a legacy data artifact, a placeholder identifier that the old system had assigned automatically to permits whose true approver had been lost during a prior data conversion. We had done at least 2 earlier conversions, one in the early 80s from microfilm and one in the late 90s when we first computerized. Placeholder values get introduced in conversions. I had seen it before, so I went back to the original paper. The city's permanent permit records are held in a climate-controlled vault in the basement of the planning annex, organized by parcel and street. Cedar Street is short. It runs 9 blocks through an older residential district on the near north side, a mix of single-family homes, a few small apartment buildings, 2 commercial corners, and a church. I pulled the physical files for the entire street, which filled 3 archival boxes, and I spent a full week reading every original document for every parcel from the earliest available record forward. The paper did not support the data artifact theory. It contradicted it. The original paper permits The actual documents with original ink carried the same approving signature and the same handwritten employee number that the database showed. These were not placeholders generated by a conversion. These were the source documents. The earliest one I found was a residential construction permit for a single-story frame house issued in the spring of 1954, approved and signed by the same hand and the same number that had approved a kitchen renovation on the same street in the autumn of last year. 70 years, the same approver. I want to convey what it is like to sit with that, because the feeling was not fear at first. It was the specific irritation of a professional confronting a number that will not reconcile. I assumed forgery or inheritance of a stamp or a clerical convention I did not understand. A long-serving employee might plausibly cover 30 years, not 70, and not with handwriting that did not change. The signature in 1954 and the signature in the most recent permit were not similar. They were identical in slant, in pressure, in the small idiosyncratic break between the third and fourth letters. People's handwriting drifts across a single decade. This did not drift across 7. I documented all of this methodically, photographing each signature block and logging each permit number, and I expanded the search. If this approver had handled Cedar Street, surely the same identifier appeared elsewhere in the city. I ran the number against the full permit corpus, all parcels, all streets, the entire 70-year span the database covered. The number appeared on Cedar Street and nowhere else. Every construction permit, every renovation approval, every demolition authorization, every occupancy certificate, every zoning variance, every utility connection authorization, every foundation repair permit, and every fire inspection sign-off ever issued for any parcel on Cedar Street bore that approver's identifier. And that approver's identifier appeared on no permit for any other street in the city, not once in 70 years. The other streets showed the ordinary churn of municipal staffing. Dozens of approvers, turning over as people were hired, promoted, retired, and died. Cedar Street had one. It had only ever had one. A reviewer assigned to a single street for 70 years is not an administrative practice. We do not assign approvers by geography, permits route by type and by workload to whoever is on the desk. There is no mechanism, and there has never been a mechanism, by which one official would receive every permit for one street and no permit for any other. The routing alone was impossible before I ever reached the question of who the person was. I did the verification work in the order any competent investigator would. I pulled the civil service records. Every approving official in planning had to have passed a civil service examination and received an appointment, and those records are kept separately from payroll precisely so that authority can be confirmed independently. There was no examination record and no appointment for the identifier. I pulled the personnel archive, the physical files, and searched not by number but by every plausible spelling of the surname rendered in the signature, which I had transcribed as best I could. Nothing. I checked the historical city directories, the old printed volumes that listed municipal employees by department year over year, going back to the 1950s. The planning office rosters were complete and legible. The approver was on none of them in any year. At this stage, I did something that, in hindsight, was the first decision I would not be able to take back. I asked the people who would remember. We have a number of retired planning and inspection staff who keep in informal contact with the department, and a few who still consult. I started with the oldest, a former chief building inspector who had retired in the late 1990s after roughly 35 years, and who, by every account, had personally signed off on half the construction in the older districts. I drove out to see him. He is sharp, precise, and pleased to talk about the old work. I described the identifier and showed him photographs of the signature. He recognized it immediately. He said the name as if it were obvious, a name I will not reproduce here, because reproducing it has begun to feel like an action with consequences. He said the approver had handled Cedar Street the whole time, that everyone knew Cedar Street permits went to that desk, that you simply routed them there and they came back approved and clean, and that in 35 years he had never once had a Cedar Street approval kicked back or questioned by the state or by any bank or insurer. I asked him to describe the person. He paused, the way you pause when a familiar answer fails to arrive. He said he supposed he had never actually been in that office. He said the approvals always came through. He said it the way you might say the mail always came, without ever having met the carrier. He was not troubled by this. That was the part that began, finally, to trouble me. An impossible fact had become, for him, simply the texture of a job he had done well. I interviewed 4 more retired employees over the following 2 weeks, 2 inspectors, a former permit clerk, and a planning commission staffer. Their accounts were consistent in the specific way that frightened me more than contradiction would have. Every one of them recognized the Cedar Street approval as routine. None of them could describe the person. None had been in the office. None found the gap remarkable until I pointed at it, and even then they reached for procedure to close it. The clerk told me gently that I was overthinking it, that the approvals were valid, that the state had audited the city's permitting 3 times in her tenure and never raised a question about Cedar Street, and that if there had been a problem, someone would have caught it long ago. She trusted the paperwork because the paperwork had outlived everyone's memory, and because nothing built on it had ever fallen down. That is, I think, the actual mechanism by which this persisted. Not concealment. There was nothing hidden. The records were all there, openly filed, freely available to anyone who pulled the boxes. The secret, if it was a secret, had never needed to be hidden, because no one had ever had a reason to assemble it. Each individual permit was unremarkable. Only the aggregate was impossible, and no one assembles the aggregate of one short street across 70 years until a vendor's deduplication engine does it in an afternoon. I brought in the documentary review because by now I needed to know how deep the dependence ran. What I found was that the entire legal and physical existence of Cedar Street rested on these approvals, completely and without exception. The property deeds referenced the occupancy certificates. The occupancy certificates reference the inspection sign-offs. The inspection sign-offs reference the construction permits. Every mortgage ever recorded against a Cedar Street parcel had relied, at closing, on a title search that confirmed the property was legally permitted and occupiable, and that confirmation traced to these documents. Every homeowner's insurance policy on the street had been underwritten on the assumption of code-compliant, permitted construction. The utility company had connected water, gas, and electric service to each address against authorized connection requests bearing the same approver's sign-off. The tax assessor had assessed each parcel as improved property based on permitted improvements. The address assignment records themselves. The documents that establish that a given lot is a recognized municipal address eligible for service ran back through the same authority. I traced one randomly chosen parcel, a modest 2-story home near the middle of the street, through every record layer, and every layer rested at its foundation on a permit signed by someone who had never been an employee, never passed an exam, never been appointed, never been paid, never retired, and never died. The houses are real. I want to be clear about that because it is the heart of the thing. I walk Cedar Street. I have walked it several times now. The houses are physically there. People live in them. They mow the lawns and take in the mail and complain to the city about the condition of the pavement. There is nothing visibly wrong with Cedar Street. The wrongness is entirely in the question of by what authority any of it was ever permitted to exist. And the answer to that question is a person who does not exist. I spoke to 2 long-term residents casually, presenting myself accurately as conducting a records audit, which is not the sort of thing that alarms anyone. An older woman who had lived in her house since the early 1970s told me her parents had bought it new, that there had never been any trouble with the title, that the city had always been good about Cedar Street. She said it with mild pride, the way people speak of a quiet street with no problems. When I asked idly whether she had ever had difficulty with permits for her own renovations, she laughed and said Cedar Street permits were the easiest in the city. Everyone knew that. They always came back fast and clean. Everyone knew that. The residents had absorbed the same impossible history the retired employees had, and they had absorbed it the same way, as a small, pleasant fact about a place they trusted casually without ever once needing to look at the thing they were standing on. I located the contractor who had pulled the most recent Cedar Street permit, the kitchen renovation from last autumn. He was a working general contractor with a current license and no reason to misrepresent anything. I asked him about the approval process. He said it was the smoothest permit he had pulled in years. Approved fast, no plan check comments, no back and forth. I asked who had approved it. He said he had no idea that you never meet the reviewer. You just submit and it comes back, and that on Cedar Street it always came back. He said this with the same casual ease as everyone else, a working man describing a desk that did its job. He had built a real kitchen in a real house on the authority of a signature belonging to no one, and the kitchen was fine, and the inspection had passed, and the homeowner was happy. By this point, I had assembled what I believed to be a complete and defensible documentary case, and I drafted an interim finding. The finding stated, factually and without speculation, that the approving authority for all Cedar Street permits over the 70-year record period could not be verified against any personnel, payroll, civil service, or appointment record. That the approval routing was inconsistent with all known municipal practice, and that the matter required legal review before the records were migrated and locked. I did not speculate about who the approver was. I did not need to. The facts were sufficient to halt the migration of that data, which was my mandate. The resistance I encountered when I escalated the finding was not dramatic, and it was not sinister. And I want to describe it accurately because the absence of drama is itself the most important fact in this report. No one tried to stop me. No one threatened me. No file went missing. The records remained exactly where they had always been, openly available. What happened instead was that the matter was understood by everyone senior to me who reviewed it, with a speed that suggested they had grasped the practical consequence faster than I had, and had arrived at the only conclusion the consequence permitted. The city attorney's office reviewed the finding. The response, delivered in a meeting I attended, was procedural and quiet. If the approving authority were declared invalid, then the permits it had issued would be, in legal terms, void from inception. Void permits would mean the structures had never been legally permitted. Unpermitted structures cannot hold valid occupancy certificates. Without valid occupancy certificates, the title histories that relied on them become defective. Defective titles cloud every mortgage, every sale, every insurance policy, every easement on the street. A single corrective action, the kind I had been hired to enable, would not fix Cedar Street. It would unmake it, on paper, retroactively, across 70 years and roughly 200 property interests. And there was no administrative remedy that could re-permit 70 years of construction after the fact without the original authority that no longer, and apparently never, existed. The attorney did not say the approver was real. No one in that room argued that the records were fine. They understood, as well as I did, that something was deeply wrong. The decision was not a denial of the problem. It was a refusal of the only available solution, because the solution was worse than the problem, and there was no third option. The finding would be filed. The matter would be noted as an unresolved historical records discrepancy. The migration would proceed, and the Cedar Street approvals would be imported into the new system exactly as they stood, validated by the simple expedient of adding the unmatched identifier to the directory as a legacy authorized approver, which is to say by formally and permanently granting the city's recognition to the authority of someone who never existed, because the alternative was to dissolve a neighborhood. I understood the logic. I still understand it. I cannot argue against it on any practical ground. Institutions continue functioning long after anyone remembers why, and they are very good at choosing continuity over truth when truth has no usable shape. The decision was, in its way, the responsible one. That is the part I have not been able to set down comfortably until now. I was given the task of closing the audit. This meant finalizing the disposition of the flagged records and certifying the Cedar Street batch for migration under the new legacy approver designation. It was a Tuesday morning. I had the file open, the same 41 originally flagged permits plus the dozens more I had since associated with the street, and I was working through the final certification when the new permitting system, already partially live, refreshed its active queue. A new permit had been submitted for a Cedar Street parcel. A detached garage, a small accessory structure, the most ordinary thing imaginable. I noted it because the address fell within my open audit, and I wanted to flag it for manual handling, so that this one at least would route to a verifiable approver. It had already been approved. The approval was time-stamped earlier that morning, several hours before I had opened the file, before the office had even opened to the public. The approving official's identifier was the same identifier. The signature block carried the same compact cursive, rendered now as a digital authorization stamp in the new system. The system that had been live for less than 2 weeks. The system that contained, until that morning, no record of this approver beyond the legacy directory entry the city had created the prior week. The authorization stamp was clean, complete, and valid. The permit was approved. I went to the permitting office in person. I asked plainly who had processed the Cedar Street garage permit that morning. There are 4 permit technicians on the front counter and a supervisor. None of them had processed it. None of them recognized it. The system showed it as approved, and the approval was attributed to an identifier that the city had only just decided to recognize, and no human being in the building had touched it. I have the finding on my desk, certified and ready to file. The decision above me has been made, and I do not expect it to change, because nothing about it can change without unmaking a street full of real houses where real people live and sleep tonight, trusting paperwork that has outlived everyone who could explain it. I had believed throughout this audit that the city was preserving the approver, accommodating an old error too expensive to correct. I no longer think that is the right way to understand it. The city is not protecting whoever signs the Cedar Street permits. The houses are real and they will go on standing, but their legality, the unbroken paper authority that lets them be owned and insured and bought and sold and lived in, has never for one day rested on anyone the city employs or remembers or can produce. It rests this morning, and presumably tomorrow morning, on whoever continues to approve the permits under that name. The work has not stopped. A new structure was authorized today. The authority that holds the entire street in legal existence is still quietly doing its job, and the only thing the city has ever been able to do about it is keep accepting the approvals. Because the moment it stops accepting them, Cedar Street stops being real. I am going to file the finding. I am going to certify the batch. I am going to let the migration proceed, because there is nothing else to do that does not make things immeasurably worse. And because every person who held this file before me reached the same conclusion and signed off cleanly and went home. I noticed that I had begun to think of my own signature on the certification and of how long it will sit attached to Cedar Street in a system designed to outlive memory.